We're joined with a very, very special guest today. I'm extremely excited about, and I'm sure that he's the reason that you're here. It's not this mug that you're here to see today. So I'll give him a proper introduction in just a minute. I know we are streaming live on Facebook right now. We're on Zoom. This will be recorded in case you miss anything. You have to step away. You have some catastrophic juice spill or a fight between your children, as often happens when you're doing the learn from home environment. This will be recorded and you'll get a link afterwards sent to you. So don't fret if you miss anything. And I know a lot of our folks are going to be watching it via recording as well. So it's 1:01. Let's get the party started. Good afternoon, or I guess good morning for some of you. My name is Rich Brancaccio. I'm the founder and CEO here at Revive Technologies. Founded Revive several years ago to help level the playing field for kids with focus and attention challenges through wearable technology. I'm joined today by Dr. Cecil Reynolds, and I will give Dr. Reynolds a proper introduction because he's certainly somebody who I've been a big fan of for a long time. So for those of you who don't know about Dr. Reynolds, he is an emeritus professor of educational psychology, professor of neuroscience, and a distinguished research scholar at Texas A&M University. He's the author of over 300 scholarly publications and the author or editor of over 45 books. He's also created more than 40 widely used psychological tests, including the Behavior Assessment System for Children, or the BASC, which is the most frequently administered test of its type in the English-speaking world. He's also been ranked the 7th most influential person in the history of clinical neuropsychology. And on top of all that, he's somebody that I'm a huge fan of. I've been a fan of Dr. Reynolds for over 15 years. I've used his assessments as long as I was a school psychologist. And I was one of his biggest fans then and still am now. So Dr. Reynolds, thank you very much and welcome.
Well, thank you, Rich. I appreciate the gracious introduction. And I appreciate you guys having me today. And I'm always surprised when people show up to listen to me talk about what I do, because my wife reminds me periodically that that's mostly just interesting to me.
Well, I'm thrilled to have Dr. Reynolds with us. Just in the spirit of full disclosure, Dr. Reynolds does work with us at Revive. In addition to some engagements like this, he also serves on our scientific and medical advisory board, and we're very lucky to have him. So this is something where we do these series for parents and for school psychologists fairly frequently. This is something we really enjoy doing, these webcasts or these webinars. And we started doing these webinars not as a rolling billboard for the company, but really as a platform to provide education and support to parents and school psychs. So we generally try not to mention our own product. When we don't mention the products that we create, we typically get bombarded at the end with questions about what is it, how does it work? I'm here to find out how it operates. So periodically we will share some of the technology from an educational perspective. But again, we're not here to sell product. We're here to really further the science, the research, and the knowledge in and around ADHD. So that's why we have Dr. Reynolds here today. So I've got some questions for him that I thought would be very interesting for you, the parents, to hear his perspective on. And then if we have time, and I believe that we will, we're going to actually open it up to allow you, the parents, to ask Dr. Reynolds some questions directly, which I think will be very exciting. So without further ado, Dr. Reynolds, I've got some questions I'm going to pelt you with. Are you ready?
Okay, well, I think I'm ready. We'll see.
So in the past, there have been claims from various individuals that they think ADHD was made up by the pharmaceutical industry, almost like some of the holidays that we joke around have been created by Hallmark. So can you share for parents some of the science that you're aware of that supports or disproves this notion?
Sure. And one of the things I like to point out to people when they start arguing that this is all a big hoax by big pharma to make big money is that ADHD was reported in the 1800s, long before there was such a thing as big pharma. In fact, if you want some time to Google fidgety Phil, there's a story that was written by a physician in the 1800s. It was actually a poem that he wrote and published about fidgety Phil. And Fidgety Phil was the child of some family friends that he had dinner with. And the poem is about what happened during that dinner with Fidgety Phil, as he called him. And in the 1800s, this poem you will recognize as providing a great description of many kids with ADHD. So we see it going way back then. And if you read German, you can read it in the original, but there are English translations of it on the web as well. But it's just kind of a fun thing to take a look at that we see from the 1800s. But then as we move into the 1900s, there were several pediatricians who started publishing articles about kids who had significant problems with attention and impulse control. And this too predates Big Pharma. And they started talking about these kids, and they characterized it then as a moral disorder. That these kids simply had a disorder of character that was related probably to their genetics and just to bad parenting. And we know now that the bad parenting is not true. That's not why kids have ADHD at all. Okay, maybe 1 in 10 million ADHD kids, but no more than that. It really is not the problem. Uh, so we've learned a lot more about it since then. And people actually started doing a lot more research on this in the 1950s. And pharmaceutical treatment was discovered completely by accident, as often happens. Uh, a new antidepressant compound what was proposed to be an antidepressant compound, was being evaluated and tested to see if it would help children. And they just discovered quite serendipitously that when children were given this compound, their behavior improved. They could attend better, they could sit longer, and they had better impulse control. And nobody expected that. And one of the key members of that research team, in fact, one of the people who was leading that effort, was a guy named Keith Connors. And he became one of kind of the folklore heroes as well as a scientific hero in the early stages of ADHD, when it was also not called ADHD, by the way. It was called either hyperkinesis, which simply means you moved around a lot. Kinetic activity was the hallmark of it then, and it really wasn't discovered until a little later, the strong attentional component. So all of this grew as the research grew. And we did see then the pharmaceutical industry jump on board with, hey, if we can treat this, this is great. And sure, they want to turn a profit doing that. Most corporations do. But they didn't invent the disorder, they didn't discover it. In fact, they had nothing to do with it. It was quite by accident that it was determined that it would treat it. And in fact, there are some very popular pharmaceutical compounds even now that nobody developed in order to treat ADHD that it was later discovered would treat ADHD. At one time, Strattera, which is, I bet, is a medicine that many of you are familiar with, um, wasn't used to treat ADHD. In fact, it wasn't used for anything because it was a failed medicine that was developed in the 1970s to treat depression, and it didn't work. And in the late 1980s, they actually were doing some additional research studies to try to figure out what can we do with this compound. And they discovered quite by accident that it was a good treatment for some kids, not all, but for some kids with ADHD. And it worked well enough that it became the second most prescribed compound for children in the world. It's not anymore because we've gotten better medicines, but it's still used, and it's still useful with some kids who have ADHD. That's the right medicine. But it's been a progression of research and serendipitous discoveries as it goes along. And now that we have advanced neuroimaging available to us, where we can actually image or visualize the brains of children while they're still alive, which is important. Uh, it's hard to get research panels to approve research that requires removing children's brains. So it's good that we can now look at living brains and see what's happening. We have discovered that many of the things we hypothesized about the brains of individuals, both youth and adults with ADHD, are pretty much true. We had a reasonably good idea, and we've been able to refine that now that we can see the living brain function. And that has supported not only the fact that ADHD is real, it's a real disorder, it's not made up, and it's a neurobiological disorder. And it has to do with both structure of the brain and the, the metabolism of the brain and how it communicates chemically. And we can elaborate on that as much as you want, Rich.
Perfect. Well, I love, there's two things you pointed out, Dr. Reynolds, that I really love that you brought up. And the first one is that, this wasn't a corporate scheme to get rich quick. We're actually very lucky. One of the folks who we've been working with for months and months and months now, Dr. Michael Ackerman, is actually the person who was behind, he was the think of him as the project leader. He was the guy behind Stratera. And we've talked a lot about the team he put together. And I've not met a more caring person who cares about the kids that they're treating than Dr. Ackerman, who was behind the development of Stratera, bringing it to market. So it was interesting for me personally as a school psychologist or a former school psychologist to see, to meet somebody and to get to know somebody very well who is behind this movement, this big drug company, and they really do care. The second thing that I love that you brought up is something I used to hear a lot when I was a school psychologist. A lot of parents, and I would be curious, you can chat, and I've got the chat box open here. If this has affected you as a parent, we would love to hear. But a lot of parents I worked with would share frequently a lot of parent guilt. And I know back, decades ago, maybe even not as long ago as we'd like to think, there was a lot of parent guilt, sometimes inflicted by, the unknowing at the time, community of practitioners who didn't really understand the etiology of ADHD like we do today. So parents had a lot of guilt back then. Some parents, many parents still harbor this guilt now. So I think it's great that you called out, this is not something that you, the parents on this webinar, did. This is nothing that you've created or a lack of care or focus or attention to your children. This was something that was there.
Yeah, and it is important to know that we need an arsenal of interventions for ADHD, and that not all kids with ADHD are the same. And there are nuances to their brain structure and nuances to the chemistry of their brains. That means that some of them will respond really well to some medical interventions, and some will respond poorly. And that's the way of the brain. It's the same with other things that we use medicines for depression, for example. There must be 50 different FDA approved medications for depression. And the reason for that has to do with the fact that they're all slightly different. They're all tweaked and fine tuned. And one that works really, really well for some people may be a disaster for another person. And ADHD medicines are no different. Stratera, to some people, is a godsend. To some people, they can't wait to get their kid off of it fast enough. So it's really an issue of having the right arsenal and being able to figure out what's going to work with which kids. There's no one size fits all. There's no cure all. And one of the things that I've been an advocate for as long as I've been in this field, which is longer than I want to admit, but I think my hair color will give me away, is that there are some approaches that we know you shouldn't take. And one of them is medicine only. As effective as medication can be in helping a person with ADHD, if that's the only thing you do, you've done that person a disservice. We know that cognitive behavioral therapies, we know that things like Revive, which actually mimics a lot of things that we used to teach people to do to redirect attention, it does that without a person having to be standing next to them all day, which is why I think it works. We have to do those things too. But if that's the only thing you do, then you're doing that person a disservice. There's no one thing to do because ADHD is pervasive in a person's life. It affects so many things that they do. And the use of medication, once you get to the right one, helps give you a better baseline of control. And it is an assist to the other interventions, to better tutoring, teaching kids better executive skills, teaching them better how to organize their study materials, how to learn better, teaching them how to learn, not just telling them you have to learn this, but teaching them how do you learn this better. And medication gives you a better baseline to work from to make all of the other things that we want to do more effective. But we need to be doing all of those other things too.
Such a great point you make in terms of teaching children how to learn. What's interesting when you're working with young children, or if you have young children, to all the parents watching today, think back to Dr. Reynolds' point. Think back to when your child was 1, 2, 3 years old. And I'm sure every parent's had that moment where you go, this child, I'm having to teach them actually how to put their shirt on. You don't think about that when they're 10, 12 years old, but they put their shirt on because you probably taught them how to get their arms through each armhole, how to flip their shirt inside out, put their socks on. That's no different when you're working with a child. Things are not as obvious as you would think. Just sit down and learn. Some kids get that pretty easily, and some kids need more direct rote instructions. I think that's a great thing to call out.
Exactly. Some kids will naturally develop good study habits and know how to study and learn. Other kids don't. But those are skills that we can teach. And it turns out that children with ADHD and youth with ADHD are less likely to develop the skills for knowing how to learn effectively, how to study effectively on their own. And targeted instruction on those things work better.
I love it. We're getting some great questions rolling in. So please keep them coming, gang. We will get to your questions towards the end. I've got a couple of questions, and some of them are actually in parallel with the questions that we're getting. So along the same path, and Dr. Reynolds, we've heard, everybody's heard this. It's been in the news, in the media. There's this notion that ADHD is overdiagnosed. It's overprescribed. What are your thoughts on this?
I think that's absolutely true. I think it is overdiagnosed. And one of the reasons for that is that the primary means of diagnosis is by parent complaint about behavior in a pediatrician's office. And even the American Academy of Pediatrics has taken a stance against that. And they have a position paper that instructs pediatricians not to engage in diagnosing ADHD in that way. It informs them that they need to engage in comprehensive diagnosis. And they need data like behavior rating data. And not just from parents, but from people who see the child in structured settings like preschools or schools. They often mention the necessity of input from school personnel to get the diagnosis right. And It's just too easy for someone in a busy medical practice to listen to a parent who comes in and describes their child's behavior and want to please their patient. And they know that if they give them something like Ritalin, for example, the child's going to calm down. Well, you know what the research says about that? The research says that Ritalin reduces the behavioral levels of children, whether they have ADHD or not. And there are still people who use response to Ritalin to diagnose ADHD. If they're not sure, they give them Ritalin. If the kid gets better, they say, aha, it must be ADHD. Well, the science doesn't support that. So that happens. And it happens because people are taking shortcuts to diagnosis and because writing a prescription is an easy answer. We can stop that by engaging in comprehensive diagnostic practices. Well diagnosed ADHD is not a problem. Off the cuff, 10-minute diagnosis of ADHD is a serious problem. And what happens is that there are what we call mimics out there. For example, children who have anxiety disorders will look, especially boys who have anxiety or have depression, look like they have ADHD. They become hyper irritable, they fidget, they have attention problems, but the underlying issue is not ADHD. It's their anxiety or their depression or the combination of the two. And many times in those kids, giving them some form of stimulant medication can make them more active, more agitated, and actually make them more difficult to treat later correctly when we get the diagnosis correct. So it's not just that misdiagnosis does no harm. It does do harm in that situation and harm beyond delaying treatment. So it's important to get the diagnosis right. But I do agree that it is overdiagnosed, but we know what to do about that. It's just hard to implement that.
You hit one item right on the head there. In terms of stimulants, can you share for parents, how do they work to help stabilize the brain? As you said, when it's already overstimulated, can you drill into that a little bit?
Sure. Well, the brain is a system, and every part of that system influences every other part. And the brain has a set of systemic controls that are designed to monitor the outside world and designed to monitor how you are responding to that outside world. That's a key aspect of behavioral control and directing your attention and knowing what to pay attention to and when it's okay not to pay attention and what you should be listening to. And there's this whole monitoring system in the brain. And the brain has two ways of working that system. It has what we call a structural address system, where different structures in the brain are in particular places close to other structures where it's easy for them to communicate. And neurons will run from one place to another. And all of that is structured. So it's like an address system. The brain will communicate to different addresses at different times for different reasons. But in order to make that addressing system work, the brain has a chemical addressing system. And the chemistry of the brain is dictated by neurotransmitter systems. And those are chemicals in the brain that are exactly what they sound like. They are neurotransmitters. So they carry communication chemically from one neuron to the next. And as they connect and form systems, and those systems are physically connected to the physical systems in the brain, and the chemical system in the brain are constantly interacting. And what we see in a majority, not every single one, but in the majority of individuals with ADHD, we see two things. we see something affecting the physical system or the structural system and the chemical system. And one of the things we see, the primary regions of the brain that dominate this communication and control center are the prefrontal regions, which are here, right behind this area, and then the pathways that run back to the center of the brain, to the brain stem, and that go up into your limbic system. And that system exerts control by stimulating different parts of your brain to pay attention at different times when that part of the brain is needed the most. And when it's not needed, it moderates that part of the brain and causes a different set of chemicals to be secreted that bring that metabolic rate down. So one of the things that we see is that individuals with ADHD have slightly fewer neurons in this area. And they don't then have quite as much control from the physical structure. And so they need the metabolic rate. They need that part of the brain to be a little more active than that of the typical individual. But in a person with ADHD, typically their chemistry and metabolism associated with that is underreactive. So it's a double whammy. And they are actually under aroused in the parts of the brain that exert control and direct attention. Now we think of them as being hyper aroused, right? They're over alert. They attend to everything they see, right? They're easily distracted. And if they need to move to do something, they move. They don't care where they are or what they're doing. You know, they get up and move, and they have these urges. And those urges make them look like they're hyper, hence the term hyperactivity. But the hyperactivity is associated with hypoactivity in the centers of the brain that are responsible for controlling that. And what we do with, for example, medication, and the reason stimulant medication works, is we stimulate those parts of the brain so that the metabolic rate of the control centers of the brain increases. And as that metabolic rate increases, their brain is just better able to do the job it was supposed to be doing to start with. And it does that in several different ways from a neurochemical standpoint. And I don't know how far into the weeds you want to go with that, but basically that's what we're doing, is increasing the metabolic rate disproportionately of the frontal regions of the brain and the communication pathways from the frontal regions of the brain to the other control centers, so that we can develop the right instructions in the frontal lobes and get those instructions to where they need to go in a timely manner. And we do that by enhancing the metabolic rate. And the brain, the neurotransmitters that do that in the brain are not randomly distributed. They exist everywhere in the brain. For example, Ritalin, one of the things it stimulates in the brain is a neurotransmitter called dopamine. It's one of the key neurotransmitters that it influences. It influences some others too, but that's probably the strongest influence. Dopamine, while it's all over your body and it's all over your brain, has a higher concentration in the frontal regions of the brain and in the frontal communication pathways and in some of the central control centers near the brainstem than it does in other parts of the brain. So if I can stimulate the brain to produce more dopamine and use that dopamine more efficiently, I will stimulate the metabolism of the frontal regions and its pathways more strongly than I will stimulate other parts of the brain. So that's why it works, really.
A related question for any parents here who are either new to the ADHD world or who are wondering. I used to get questions from parents a lot. They would say, is this normal? Do other families face these challenges? Do other kids endure these challenges? So you hit up upon a couple of challenges in particular in terms of things like self-control. You mentioned where it can be harder to inhibit, you know, excited behaviors, things like that. Are there any other things you can let parents know about that, say, their child may experience who has ADHD and experience in a more challenging way than maybe another peer may not experience that or may not demonstrate those same challenges?
Well, as you know, even within the spectrum of individuals who have ADHD, some have more pervasive problems with attention and distractibility, and some have more pervasive problems with controlling their physical movements and impulses. So there's a lot of variation. And uh, one of the things that we push kids to do very early on in education, as you know, is sit down, shut up, and pay attention, right? The three things that it's most difficult probably for individuals with ADHD to do. Uh, they don't sit down very long. It's hard for them to shut up, and and it's called attention deficit hyperactivity disorder. So as you know, with their peers, that's where they're going to get hit the hardest, particularly in school or in other structured settings where the expectation is that they'll do that, that they will sit down, shut up, and pay attention. And so they tend to get into more trouble, if you will. And the trouble escalates more rapidly than it does with their peers. And that's a big issue for ADHD kids. Once they start getting into trouble, the trouble escalates because they don't control what they say very well. If it pops into their head, it's just as likely to pop out of their mouth. Now, sure, that's something that affects all kids. So it's all relative. We compare that to other kids the same age. And compared to other kids the same age, if you have ADHD, if it pops in your head, there's a much higher probability it's going to pop out of your mouth. And that will be misinterpreted by people in authority, like teachers and principals, as being subordinate or being sassy or whatever your local colloquial term is for backtalk and and being disrespectful in some way. So there's a bigger issue with that and with the escalation. And unfortunately, very few people in settings like that, even teachers, are not trained in de-escalation techniques. They're trained to be authoritative. And while many children will respond to that authoritative approach, that's very difficult. It's just much more difficult for a person with ADHD to respond initially to that authoritative approach. The first thing we want to do is de-escalate. As they're exhibiting behavior that's disruptive to other people, objectionable in some way or whatever. De-escalate, de-escalate, de-escalate. Don't try to force them with authority and punishment into sit down, shut up, and pay attention. It's not as effective, and in fact, it's counterproductive. So that's something we need to watch at all times with persons with ADHD. Is once something starts going, don't let it steamroll, and don't feed that process. De-escalate. And we do that by active listening, by understanding, by reflecting back to them what we think they're experiencing and let them tell us if we're right. And we coach them down. We coach them down. We don't push them down.
I love that. One of the questions I was going to ask you, and you beat me to it, which is excellent, is, are there any strategies in terms of traditional punishment paradigms being ineffective? And I love what you said about coaching them down from where they are. One thing I used to do when I was a school psychologist, and I would try to share this with parents. Now, warning for parents listening, it is way easier for Dr. Reynolds and I to talk about this and say, yeah, just do this. When you're in the moment with that child and they're feeling explosive and you're feeling explosive as a parent, it's difficult. It's like refereeing a hockey match or hockey game sometimes.
And if I can jump in on that just for a minute, Rich.
Sure.
With my ADHD interruption here. One of the things, and I'll just share a little piece of research with you guys that I think you will understand, since this is a parent group, I think you'll understand this better than anybody, including professionals I talked to about this research. We have a scale that we published some years ago called the Parenting Relationship Questionnaire. And one of the things we use that to assess is the parent's perception of their relationship with their child and their level of involvement in the child's life and their disciplinary strategies and things like that, so we can get a better handle on that when we're trying to design interventions. And there's a scale on that measure called Relational Frustration. And we have lots of data on lots of clinical samples. Kids with really severe things like autism, kids with intellectual disability, kids with schizophrenia, lots and lots of different things, kids with anxiety, with depression, and children and youth with ADHD. No group reports a higher degree of relational frustration with their child than the parents of children with ADHD. Of all those clinical groups,
so
the parents of children with ADHD are the most frustrated. And I think that speaks exactly to what you're saying. It's really easy for me to tell you what to do. What's not easy is being consistent with it and doing it every day and not falling back on, well, damn it, because I said so and I'm your dad, or, something like that. And none of us like to hear that come out of our mouth, but every now and then, I bet it does.
Well, I love the concept around what you said in terms of, it sounds like almost taking a step back, and it is hard. Something I used to do, to piggyback on what Dr. Reynolds said about, I love the phrase he used, coaching them down from the elevated state at which they are. I used to use there's something in martial arts, when you just kind of get out of the way of something, instead of trying to block it, you just kind of move. We call it a parry. So you're redirecting. And I used to use that with children, because if they're not in a teachable mind state, you can't have a conversation if you're both keyed up this high. So sometimes you can use something as a parent or a teacher to distract the child from what they're originally focused on, that's upsetting. Get that moment to get them kind of off their pace, if you will, and then you can get them back to ground level to say, hey, let's talk about what's going on. How do you feel? This is what I'm seeing.
And there's a great deal of research out there that says that punishment paradigms are not terribly effective with most kids. They are effective to some degree with most kids, but they are particularly ineffective with youth with ADHD. And that has to do with the fact that this is a neurobiological disorder. It's not that they don't know the rules and can't remember the rules, and that they are purposely setting out to break the rules. It's the underlying neurobiological issue that causes them to act without thinking. That's just kind of, obviously everybody's thinking all the time, but they don't have that control center that kicks in. So punishment is not something that works very well. They don't engage in the typical cost benefit analysis that even another child of the same age will do for particular behavior. So, um, it really just doesn't help, and it also can produce resentment in kids, and it creates problems between parenting partners as well, because it's hard to agree on exactly how to do that. So, just the little catchphrase that I used, just to bring us back to that, coach them down, don't push them down. And
Love that.
coaching them down will be more effective, but you got to remember it's going to take you longer. And you have to remain calm and cool while you're coaching them down. De-escalation. Right?
Sometimes it's okay to take a step away, parents, because it's natural. It's a natural human reaction for you to get, as Dr. Reynolds said, you're dealing with a challenging condition that creates mutual frustration. So it's not just you. Don't feel bad. You're not a bad mom or a bad dad. It's natural for you to get emotional, but it's really helpful for you to take a step back for a few moments or a few minutes if you need to, and then come back to it and address it. You don't have to nail it immediately the second that there's a
That's
challenge
right.
in front of you.
And you will figure out what works best with de-escalation with your child over time. But the key things are to develop an understanding of what they're doing, why they're doing it. And a great way to do that is to ask them in a nice way, calmly. It's not, why the heck are you doing that? It's okay, I don't understand what you're doing. It's more, and then reflect back what they tell you. Okay, so you you wanted to do this. Is that right? Or you wanted to get this, or you wanted, and you reflect back, and you go with that. You go wherever they take you with that, and you de-escalate by reflecting back and listening, and letting them know that you're really trying to understand.
I will issue a challenge to the parents, both live on Zoom here today, to the parents following us live on Facebook right now. I issue a challenge for you to ask your child the next time you get into one of those "what the heck are you doing" conversations that you know happen probably on a daily basis. But truly, like Dr. Reynolds said, give them a moment and ask them to truly give you a response. What they are doing, what are they thinking about? Not in a condescending way. Not what are you thinking, but why do you think that happened? The responses you'll get, I guarantee, will both shock, amuse, warm your heart, sadden you, and everything in between. But the responses the kids have are really profound when we actually put them in a position to give grown-up feedback, as I call it, because they are way more capable, even younger children, than you would think, to give an intelligent response to help give you some insight. Got another question, Dr. Reynolds. This is going to be my last question for you. I've got a bunch queued up, but I want to give some time for parents. But this actually is one of the parent questions, and is one of mine as well. Can you talk to the parents today about what is the real effects you see and understand as an effect of diet, sugar, other dietary components that you see with ADHD?
That comes up a lot, and basically, kids should eat a good, well balanced diet, right? And to the extent that they eat any kind of extreme diet, it's probably not good for them. And there are things out there that you can go and read about, like that are still popular in some areas, like, for example, the Feingold diet. And the Feingold diet was designed, for example, to eliminate naturally occurring salicylates from dietary intake. And the rationale was that Feingold believed that a lot of children and he claimed as much as 80% and sometimes more, of persons who had been diagnosed with ADHD were having allergic reactions to salicylate. And salicylate's very common out there. It's a derivative of salicylic acid, which is basically aspirin. And It's in a lot of foods. There are naturally occurring salicylates in many fruits, many vegetables, all kinds of things. So it's a very rigid diet. Well, it turns out that there, in challenge studies, where you actually look at this and see when kids eat a salicylate free diet versus when they don't, that about 2 or 3 out of 100 persons diagnosed with ADHD will improve over time on the Feingold diet. So does it work? Well, it works for about 2 or 3 out of 100, not what Feingold claimed. And that's led to other dietary claims that people have this diet and that diet for ADHD. Well, it turns out that it's rare that any of this works for more than a very, very tiny percentage of kids. So um, we don't recommend those things. Uh, as far as dietary supplements, about the only thing that's not a natural depressant, and there are some natural tranquilizers out there being marketed over the counter that if you give your kids enough of them, you might as well be giving them uh, a benzodiazepine like Xanax or something like that. Just because it's natural doesn't mean it's not engaging in sedation. So we don't recommend those. There are a few things. The one thing that consistently shows up as having benefit are high doses of omega-3 fatty acids, fish oil, and that has very few side effects. The only real side effect that we see with that is that if you engage in high doses of fish oil, for the first 3 or 4 weeks, it can induce runny bowels, which is unpleasant, but your body adapts after that and it goes away. But most people don't experience that. And by a high dose, I mean um, double a triple strength dose of fish oil. If you were taking, for example, some of them will have, you'll see labels, it'll say fish oil, and they'll have another bottle that says double strength and another that says triple strength. Well, two of the triple strength is considered to be a high dose. That's prescription level dosing. You can get a prescription for fish oil. It's equivalent to 2 triple strength over the counter fish oils. And we do not recommend using omega-3 acids from flaxseed with individuals with ADHD, particularly boys. With girls, it's probably okay. It has some other effects. The flaxseed derivative has some other undesirable effects with boys, but from fish oil is great. And it's not going to be a huge intervention. It's not going to work like Ritalin works. It's not going to do those things, but it helps. It has a little bit of a measurable soothing effect, if you will, on the brain and the neurotransmitter systems. So in that sense, it can be effective. And then let me try to address the sugar question, which is more complicated. Basically, anybody who eats sugar in isolation of a balanced meal will experience cognitive and behavioral effects. Because what happens if you eat too much sugar or you eat sugar in isolation as opposed to eating it in the same meal where you've consumed a significant amount of protein, then your blood sugar level or glucose levels go on a roller coaster ride. And it doesn't matter if you have ADHD or not. That's going to cause you to get jittery. It's going to cause you to have attentional issues. It's going to cause you to get hyper irritable. It does all of that by the way the changes in that blood glucose level, which really go on really just a roller coaster ride if you disproportionately consume sugar in the absence of a well-balanced meal. So it may affect kids with ADHD more strongly, but small amounts of sugar in the context of a balanced diet are not an issue. Beyond, you know, the ordinary kind of issues with sugar. Sugar is a little bit inflammatory to your system. Refined sugars are. There's some things like that. A lot of people try to eat a refined sugar-free diet. The key is moderation and balance in all of these things. And sugar that is eaten in moderation as part of a balanced meal is not going to cause your kids to have to freak out behaviorally. But if you give them 2 chocolate bars before bedtime, drink some coffee because you're going to be up with them.
You've got me rethinking my eating strategy here, Dr. Reynolds. I guess the handfuls of candy hearts I eat around Valentine's Day are not doing me any favors when I'm trying to stay up late and pay bills, huh?
Well, they might help you stay up late, but you might not be as effective during that time. But, again, balance in all things.
Can you talk a little bit? We had a question. I thought it was a good question. There's a lot of buzz around something that to me is relatively new. Like the last year or so, I've heard a lot about this, and I don't know a lot about it. A parent had asked, in line with what we were talking about from a healthy dietary standpoint, and what we can do, as you mentioned, the omega-3 fatty acids, fish oils. Parent asked about CBD oils and ADHD. Have you heard anything about that? Do you have any familiarity with that?
Well, first of all, there is almost no research on the effects of CBD oils with people under the age of 18. And that's because it is rightfully so very difficult to get that kind of research approved. You don't want to be the one doing that research. It's potentially problematic. So we really just don't know much about CBD oil in children, and we don't know much about how it's going to affect ADHD in youth. There is some research on various cannabis derived products with adults. I don't follow that literature with adults really closely, so I wouldn't want to comment on that, but it's going to be quite a while before we have sufficient understanding about CBD oil and whether or not it's not only safe but effective in treating anything with children. And you know, there are some studies regarding certain very rare forms of epileptiform activity that it seems to be effective with. But beyond that, safety and efficacy are problematic at this point. We don't understand it.
That's a perfect response, Dr. Reynolds. We're getting some comments also from some folks appreciating, you know, your tenor in the conversation and bringing a really research based perspective to all these different topics that we're hurling at you. And we're also getting a lot of parents who are saying things like, you know, they're tearing up, they're crying because we're touching on some things that are very, you know, immediate to them and very near and dear to their hearts. So,
well, and these kids are tough. These kids are tough. I know what I was like, and it's.
We've got just a couple of minutes, folks. We do have a hard stop at 2 p.m. So we've got about 5 minutes. If you have a question, please let us know. I will try to view it and get it up there. Let's see here as I scroll. Screen time. That's a great question. It's very, very appropriate during COVID. How about screen time, Dr. Reynolds? Anything you can think of, any any studies or any best practice people should keep in mind?
Screen time during the daytime doesn't seem to be a big issue. Screen time in the evening is associated with sleep disruption. And sleep disruption increases ADHD symptomatology. So there are a very small number, but if it's your kid, it's a big number of kids who display ADHD symptoms and get diagnosed with ADHD, who in fact have sleep apnea. And once that's diagnosed and properly treated, their ADHD symptoms go away. And it has to do with a sleep disorder. And screen time after dark is associated with more restless sleep, delayed sleep, just less time sleeping. And that's just the way it is. If you limit screen time in the evening, that's a good thing to do. And screen time, though, during the daytime light hours does not appear to be nearly the issue as it is after sundown.
I will throw one more question at you. That was extremely helpful, even for me as an adult who I think I've self-diagnosed with ADHD. Always helpful for me to hear that, especially from a world-renowned expert such as Dr. Reynolds.
Well, I can tell you, a lot of us, myself included, have a habit, and I like to go in and do a final check on my email or something like that right before I go to bed. And if I spend more than about 10 or 15 minutes on that, it delays my going to sleep. And it's a bad habit.
Yeah, Josh from our call here, one of the participants mentioned the blue light that's emitted on screens and devices around bedtime, and it sounds like
that's probably the source of it. It's the blue light, and there is ongoing research about using blue light filters to counteract some of that, and I don't know that we understand that just yet, but there's not really much downside to using blue light filters. I have blue light filter glasses that I use. If I'm spending a lot of time on the web, I'll stick on my blue light filters.
I'll give us one more question. We've got about 2 minutes. And I want to say thank you to Angela. She said she has a bunch of friends who want to watch this, but they can't because they're working. So we'll put this on our Facebook page. We will keep the recording, make it available for you to share out with your friends. Someone asked a question. I'm going to paraphrase. This parent said that her child can memorize and retain information about every World War II fact that comes across the plate, but then really struggles when it comes to math, multiplication tables. Can you talk just very briefly, Dr. Reynolds, about, I guess almost a public service announcement for people to highlight the fact that there are sometimes comorbid conditions, there are, learning disabilities that go alongside ADHD.
Yeah, and nothing about ADHD makes you immune from individual differences that occur in the general population. The fact that your child may be a child with ADHD may have absolutely nothing to do with that. If they didn't have ADHD, they may show that pattern. And it has, it's more likely to have to do with interest and how much that attracts their interest. But we also tend to be interested and intrigued and spend more time doing things that we're successful at. And a good comprehensive assessment of cognitive skills can give you information about that. What is it about math that causes the problem? Is it the sequential nature of the math problems that are being encountered? Is it memorization of math facts? Is it lacking the fundamental understanding of the rules of mathematics? Those kinds of things that might make it more difficult and discourage your child from spending time doing that and spending time doing something they're just better at. I mean, that's something we all do, right? We all gravitate toward things we're better at. We get more satisfaction from it. it's much more reinforcing. And the rules of behavior say you go where you get fed, right? And if we're really good at something, that satisfaction we get from doing that and engaging in more of it feeds us. And we avoid things we're not good at. So it can really snowball on us. But without seeing, a good comprehensive cognitive profile, we can't really answer that question about a specific child. But there are lots of kids out there who have trouble with math and do great with things that are more language related, who read really well, but then they have dyscalculia. And we're aware of that. We know about those kids. And there are ways to approach that, but you can't approach it in the absence of a good cognitive profile and understanding, because the reason for that is not the same with all kids.
That's a great point. And if you have questions about psychoeducational assessments, things like that, we have done some webinars where we've touched upon those things. We have a couple of blogs that I've written that touch upon, what is a psychoeducational evaluation? What does this mean? What is an IEP? So please feel free to check those things out. I'd like to say thank you, a huge thank you to Dr. Reynolds for coming out and speaking with our parents today and myself. We really appreciate it. I always learned a ton every time Dr. Reynolds and I sit down. Today was no exception. So thank you again, Dr. Reynolds. We really appreciate it.
Well, thank you. I appreciate you giving me an opportunity to talk about this. I really do understand from my own clinical practice how difficult it is to be a parent of these children. But I also know what great things we can do. I know what great things the kids can do as well. We describe ADHD in one of my books as like having a Ferrari brain with bicycle brakes. So we still want to nurture that Ferrari engine that's in that brain. We just want to help them develop better brakes, right?
Absolutely. I love it. Somebody just said Dr. Reynolds was awesome. And I agree.
Well, thank you.
Somebody also asked us where can they get some information to get this link to find our Facebook page. If you email our marketing manager, Morgan, who set this up today, her email address, I posted it in the chat. It's just morgan.coder, K-O-D-E-R, morgan.coder@revivetech.com. On that note, thank you all so much for coming out. As Dr. Reynolds said, amazing things can happen. Be patient, stick with it. And just know that the fact that you're engaging in things like this, where you're bettering yourself from an educational perspective, you're leaps and bounds ahead of so many other people. You're doing great work. It's not easy. Keep it up. Thank you all so much.
Hang in there, guys.
Thanks, everybody.
All right. Bye-bye.
Bye, all.